Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Rise of Privacy Tech's Data Privacy Day event. This session is about the marketplace demand for privacy. I'm Lourdes Turrecha, the founder of the Rise of Privacy Tech. With me today, I have Ben Moskowitz, who is the director of digital labs at Consumer Reports. Prior to that, he was the director of development for innovation at International Rescue Committee. And then previous to that, correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, you were also Senior Director of Strategy at Mozilla Foundation. We have a Q&A chat function, so folks, if you have questions, feel free to pose them in the chat, and we will make sure to check them out and address them throughout the session. Ben, do you have anything to add about your background? You have quite an extensive background in technology and in privacy, so I want to make sure that if there was something that I missed, that was my omission. Feel free to share.
No, I think you called it. I call myself a public interest technologist, and I've worked at sort of the intersection of what's good for consumers and the public as a whole, but also I love building and playing with new things. And so the work we do at Consumer Reports at the Digital Lab is every bit that. We're involved in product testing. You think of Consumer Reports and like testing fridges and cars and TVs. We're helping Consumer Reports include privacy and security testing as one of the measures of whether a product is good, for instance. We're doing a lot of policy work, helping expand data rights for consumers, doing a little bit of innovation work. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk today about the market demand for privacy and also some of the work that we're doing. So hopefully it'll be a good conversation.
We'll have wonderful conversations throughout. I'm really excited about what we have in store, especially our session, key indicators of the rise of privacy tech or privacy preserving technologies, privacy enhancing technologies, however we may want to label them. And that's one of the work that we will be tackling this year. The Rise of Privacy Tech is defining this space. We'd love to collaborate with Consumer Reports on that if we can. I know we discussed that at some point. But some of the key indicators that we've seen are obviously the regulations, right? The increasing number of regulations requiring privacy by design. Dr. Kavukian was just talking about that on the main stage. We also have the funding. If you check Crunchbase released a report last year, and if you just look at their privacy companies hub, you'll see that we have at least 700 privacy tech startups listed there. And if you look at the past few years, up to $4 billion in investments invested towards those companies. And then lastly, we have customer expectations, both on the consumer and business side. I really love, there are amazing studies out there, but I really love the Consumer Reports a mid-year network study that was released just a few months ago about the marketplace for privacy, which is the inspiration for this session that we're having today. Can you key findings about high-level key findings about this study? Sure. and share them today?
Yeah, so the intent of the study was to interrogate whether it's true that consumers don't actually want privacy. You often hear from investors and entrepreneurs that they can't build products that are privacy-enhancing products, or even B2B products, because there's just not a whole lot of demand for it. The incentives in the marketplace are for more data collection and more data processing. And this is one of those topics that's it's a macro topic, so anytime you try to talk about it in that sense, you're not going to do the complexity justice. But what we wanted to do is just check and see from a consumer perspective, how true is that? So we did a couple things. One is we did sort of a historical, last 25 years study of public opinion about privacy. And Consumer Reports and Pew and lots of organizations like that have been doing this kind of work, for decades now. And so we find that if anything, people are more demanding of privacy now than they were in the past. So at a minimum, it's been pretty consistent throughout. But I think there's an argument to be made that as people become aware of some of the consumer harms or the personal harms that can come from a seemingly disparate and systemic problem, they actually become more likely to want and to demand privacy. And so we can dig in on exactly what we found there in our 25 years of public opinion studies. We also ran sort of a forced choice exercise where we put together a large nationally representative panel and we introduced 6 product categories. Some that you think of as being really privacy centric, some that you don't. So the categories included VPNs, TVs, cars, connected cameras, smart speakers, and we used conjoint analysis, which is a method that probably a lot of folks in marketing are familiar with, where we varied the different feature levels and prices so that we could isolate, willingness to pay and the impact of varying any one of those features. And the headline there is on all of the products, privacy actually did have a pretty significant impact, meaning it was desirable as a feature, and willingness to pay generally did go up. Now, we'll probably dive in on this also, but you cannot take that to the bank, right? So of course we'll hear that people's preferences might not always translate to their purchasing behaviors. But the sort of third thing we did is try to put all that in context and try to understand where we are, in 2020, 2021, given all the kind of macro trends that you talked about. So really happy to dive in and kind of talk more about each of those things. But that's basically what the report's trying to do.
Well, thank you for that high-level overview. We are certainly going to dive into several of those topics that and findings that that the Consumer Reports Image Network study found. I want to start with the consumer aspect of it, right? The consumer demand for privacy. In the investment space, the B2C privacy tech space has been lagging behind the B2B space in terms of investment. And, when I talk to VCs about this, they say, like you were mentioning or pointing out earlier, they say something like, consumers don't really care about their privacy. They just give it up to the coolest app, right? Like someone was sharing about how when we, every time there's a new cool social media app, we're just, willing to hand over all the data that we have, our voice data, our facial recognition, our location, geolocation. And then the other thing that VCs cite is that consumers don't really want to pay for privacy. And I don't blame them, right? From the privacy perspective, a lot of privacy practitioners say that consumers should, it's a right, it's not something to be paid for. So that's one argument there. And then we saw last year during the pandemic, several studies about how consumers weren't willing to, even in the midst of a pandemic, consumers weren't willing to give up their data for contact tracing or other types of COVID tech solutions. May they be health warrants or immunity wallets and so on. Are these in line with the findings that you were mentioning earlier? And if you were to look at, not just the studies that we discussed, but specifically your study, the Consumer Reports one, is there a clear consumer demand for privacy, and why? If so, or if not, why do you say so?
Maybe we can start with the really core question, do people pay for privacy? We looked at a lot of the economics papers, countless PhD theses have actually been done on this exact topic. And one way of reading all that literature is to say, generally, people won't pay to gain privacy above the level that they've got now. But when you do these economics kinds of experiments, they absolutely will pay to avoid a loss of privacy. So there's been lots of kind of behavioral psychology studies like that. Hey, I'll give you $1 and we won't leak your address book again. Or your address book hasn't been leaked yet. Give me $1 and it won't get leaked. The second one is one that generally people are more likely to pay for. But it's really hard to take like a behavioral psychology kind of experiment and then extrapolate. Well, what does that mean for the whole market? From our perspective as Consumer Reports, we kind of see this as a market failure, okay? We think that consumers clearly do want privacy and they value privacy in any number of ways, but the market incentives have not, been there to create the kind of race to the top where companies are competing to meet consumers' expectations. There's some reasons for that. One of the reasons is that the internet blew up really quickly in a matter of decades around what's basically an opt-out model, right? And we know that in the US, you don't really need a whole lot of affirmative or explicit consent. And so that's part of it. And when we did the meta-analysis of public opinion, we found that like in the 90s and the early 2000s, people had these erroneous beliefs like, oh, if the website has a privacy policy, then they're not selling my information. Of course, that's not what it means to have a privacy policy. That's just a disclosure of your policy. So I think that the consumer awareness, the consumer understanding, the fact that the legal regime was one that did not create the incentives that would match consumers' stated preferences. I think that can all explain to you why people nonetheless engage in these possibly risky behaviors, right? And people talk about the privacy paradox. They say they want privacy, but then they use Facebook but again, I would look at this as a market failure. All things being equal, if you knew that there was a Facebook and a privacy enhancing Facebook and they were equivalent, of course, people would use privacy enhancing ones. So again, these are very complex topics. We cannot do them justice when we talk in the macro sense like this. But part of what we're trying to do is to adjust the incentives a little bit. We want the market to compete to better honor consumers' preferences.
I'm with you, all the way there. The market failure point that you made is certainly interesting, and thank you for sharing with us, some of the reasons that you've found that contributed to this market failure. I completely agree. That the legal incentives weren't there. I'm hopeful that with the rise of privacy laws like GDPR and CCPA and CPRA and Brazil's, and now that we're talking about a federal one in the US, and Dr. Kavikin was just talking about Canada updating theirs, that we are presenting the right incentives, and it looks like the market is starting to respond, right, with entrepreneurs building solutions that address some of these privacy requirements in these laws. I want to follow up. If you've studied this for a while, and looking at your study, your research, you've looked at consumer privacy sentiment for more than 20 years, if I remember the data correctly.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe the evolution of consumer privacy sentiment for the past 25 years?
We looked at the last 25 years. We started with 1995, which we noted as kind of a meaningful year, in the development of the internet. And from all the meta-analysis that we did, we sort of bucketed, 4 stages or 4 eras in consumer zeitgeist. Now, this isn't super scientific, but this is kind of a helpful tool to explain what we saw. So the first era, we call it the cautious users era. So people are learning, oh, there's this World Wide Web, and there's all these neat things I can do online. And you have some very innocent fears, about someone stealing your information and hackers, phishing. But generally it's a cautious optimism. And so you have a wave of early adopters. They're evangelizing their friends and family. You can enjoy the internet. It's safe, and around 2005 is when we begin to mark this change. We start to see confident users. So, I don't have any problem giving my credit card out over the internet. I don't really worry about, my browsing, and I don't mind signing up for accounts. And it's almost like an overconfidence in a way. You start to see some of those things I was mentioning earlier. Around 2011, we mark kind of a new stage, which we call the concerned users stage. And, a lot of this comes from, media reporting and things like the Wall Street Journal's What They Know series, right, which actually brought a lot of the things that the ad tech world knew about and was very conscious of to a mainstream audience, but also things like the Snowden leaks. And so, understanding that privacy and surveillance are possibly linked. So there's a real concern, that starts to emerge. And finally, we note, around 2016, a shift to more of a critical approach to technology. So your average internet user is much more of a critical thinker, and maybe a skeptic even about the internet, and lots of reasons for that. A lot of them have to do with Facebook during the election, and all of the Cambridge Analytica stuff. But we kind of use these 4 stages as a heuristic to think about the evolution, right? Cautious, then confident, maybe overconfident, then concerned, and today very critical. And you talked about the kind of legal regimes that are evolving, and I think GDPR was the big bellwether, of course, but I think you're seeing these concerns now reflected in public policy. There are new obligations, there are new sets of laws and procedures to comply with, if you're a company. So I agree that that's driven a huge wave of investment in the B2B side, because now every company in the world needs to get compliant. Now you're hearing, well, there's not a market for the B2C stuff. And I disagree with that. In fact, we think that the users are ahead of where the market is. And I can talk a bit about why we think that, but there's some evidence of that.
Yeah, let's dig into that. And I want to acknowledge some of the comments that we have in the chat. Melanie Ensign says one of the things that she thinks about when we're talking about consumer privacy tech is how, for instance, Moxie had licensed his end-to-end encryption protocols for Facebook and WhatsApp as a source of revenue to create Signal and support it as a nonprofit. And while that model may not work for everyone, selling B2B products is one way to help these companies, organizations serve their users' privacy. So indirectly, at least. I'd love to, dig deeper into what you've seen in that space. If you have any thoughts.
That's the reality often, because there's not a lot of point of sale opportunities, if you're trying to offer a privacy tool yet. We can talk about that. I worked for Mozilla for a long time, and we prided ourselves on Firefox being the most private browser that you could have. And of course, Firefox was supported by search deals, with Google and the others. So yeah, that's probably a fair characteristic of how you need to work to achieve scale. But I think that there may be some new opportunities in the future. I think that the way that the app economy is shaking out, some other things, different standards now, which we can get into all of that. I think that there's more space for sort of B2C privacy enhancing tools. And I frankly think that CCPA is going to be a big foothold for those kinds of things.
Right. So CCPA, CPRA, in addition to the GDPR's, standard data subject rights, right? I mean, I suppose the distinction that CCPA, CPRA adds to the GDPR suite is the disclosure for financial incentives and valuation of data. Is that one of the things that you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I think that's something that entrepreneurs and civil society groups can build on. But also, I'll point out two initiatives I think are really interesting that kind of spring from CCPA. So one is resurrecting the do not track protocol, and it's now the do not sell solution. So if folks want to learn more about this, globalprivacycontrol.org, any kind of client application, right? Any kind of user agent, potentially now can begin to signal user intents. So the whole idea of broadcasting a user intent, I think, is a really interesting one. But also the authorized agent provisions of CCPA. So you mentioned you have all these data rights. You can ask that your data is not sold. You can ask for it to be deleted. You can ask for a copy of it. We did a study with 500 volunteers. We pulled up all of the data brokers in the California data broker registry, and we assigned each data broker to 3 volunteers. So we got a good picture of, are these actually rights that normal humans can exercise? And the spoiler is that they're not really rights that normal humans can exercise. They're really uneven. They make you jump through a lot of hoops. They may not confirm that they received your request. Some companies totally ignored the requests. So what's the good news? There is this idea of an authorized agent where you can delegate your rights. You can say, I trust Consumer Reports or Mozilla or a new startup to be my agent and to deliver these requests. And I think this is like an extension of my will, right? This is like another user agent kind of idea. So we're really interested in the idea of authorized agents and how we can build on that. And can that be a new category? And yeah, we're getting some great comments in the chat here.
Yeah, we are. For those interested in GPC, thank you for mentioning them. We have the creators and founding members chat later in one of the sessions, I believe around noon or 1 p.m. But please check the schedule. Don't quote me on that. So we have folks from Brave and New York Times and Wesleyan University talk about how they went about creating global privacy control. I do like, I agree with you, Ben. Going back to CCPA/CPRA rights, I've seen the same thing personally, but also from other consumers who post CCPA were very vocal about how difficult it was for them to exercise those rights. And it sounds like you guys are doing some work. We do see some startups popping up in the data subject rights space, but it sounds like Consumer Reports is also doing some work in that space. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, a lot of the B2B investment is in companies that help other companies become compliant and better handle data subject access requests. So you've got the Wirewheels, the Ethicas, the OneTrusts, and the list goes on. And we don't have a lot of B2C solutions popping up. So I can name a few that we've seen, or at least organizations developing authorized agents. One is a company called Privacy Bee out of Atlanta. And they offer a service where you can sign up, you can give them a limited power of attorney, and then they'll go and opt you out or delete your accounts without you really having to do anything. There's a company called Mine. If you go to saymine.com, they have kind of a different approach to this. But yeah, lots of new companies coming up. We are interested in this space. We have launched a sort of experimental authorized agent, and we've been sending requests on users' behalf at small scale. And we're really interested in whether this can be a new category privacy enhancing tool. Let's list all the data brokers that may not provide you, the consumer, with any direct value. And if you just click one button, maybe we can take care of that for you. And we can delete that data. We can reduce your risk of identity theft if there's a breach. We can kind of cut down on some of the systemic things and explain why those are important. But even the access right becomes quite interesting. And this kind of moves us out of the space of privacy and into, next gen ideas. But what if you could have, cooperative of people who try to pool their data and make sense of things that it could not have made sense of because the data was previously siloed. So as a consumer protection org, we think it would be very cool if we could maybe name a problem that's impossible to study because it's happening in a black box, but then work with consumers to send mass data subject access requests, pool what we learn, and learn about what's happening in that black box in a way that would not previously been possible. So you might think of this as like turning it into a FOIA request, right? It becomes a tool for journalism or research, and in that way you can learn about what companies may know about you or what might be doing with your data in a way that, again, you really couldn't because nothing in the public disclosures might get into that level of detail. And so we think that that's also quite interesting. But I would say that all of Consumer Reports' work on data subject rights is like firmly an R&D project. So if there's anyone out there who wants to brainstorm or chat, we'd love to talk to you offline.
Absolutely. We do have a few startups here in attendance. I know, you mentioned Privacy Bee. I believe they're participating today. On the business side, we also have Transcend, help businesses kind of build the data privacy infrastructure to handle those requests on the business side, not the consumer side. Speaking of the business side, I'd like us to spend some time talking about the business demand for privacy. So we covered consumer demand. In this space, we've seen studies from Cisco last year, for instance, with several amazing results. One of them finding that there's a 270% return on investment on businesses' investments into their privacy programs. And then this year they released an updated, I believe it's their fourth year doing this study, an updated study, and also had interesting key findings about how privacy, 90% of respondents of businesses say that privacy is now at the board level. So or C and board level. So it's top of mind for businesses. Are these in line with some of your findings in terms of what you've been seeing? And so, like, the same way that we tackled consumer demand for privacy, how do you think, or how would you characterize the business demand for privacy?
Well, I think we want to make an argument. We've got some data to support this argument that companies should really view privacy not as a source of downside risk. It's not just about compliance and avoiding downside risk. it can be a source of competitive advantage. We really want to make that point. And I'll just offer a few data points that kind of support that. So when we polled consumers last year and said, who should be most responsible for protecting your online privacy? Right? We gave them the option of companies, the federal government, individuals, right? So I should be responsible, and a whole bunch of others. And a plurality, 42% of everyone in a nationally representative survey said companies should be most responsible. So consumers, I think you can argue, really expect and view it as a sign of quality and trustworthiness when a company takes responsibility. I think that explains why you've seen a lot of companies really make this a point of their marketing and communications and public thought leadership. I mean, look at Microsoft. Microsoft did not need to offer its CCPA infrastructure to people in Wyoming, and they did. And I think that the calculus there, is pretty clear. You have to build it, but also you can engender a whole lot of trust and goodwill if you do that. But also, we looked at things like this common idea that people buy iPhones because they perceive them to be more private or secure, and we wanted to know, is that true? And it turns out it is true. So we looked at people who switched from Android to iPhone, and for the people who did that in the last 5 years, a quarter of them cited specifically that an Apple phone is safer and has more security features. 18% said they wanted a phone with better protections for my privacy. So, when we all see the Apple marketing, the billboards and everything, it's not just that they're trying to speak to us, the privacy professionals. They're really making a very calculated differentiation, and we believe, based on the data we've got, that it is contributing to their market share and the brand glow for an Apple device. I'm sure that's not going to shock anybody, but now we've got data to show that it's working.
Exactly. We've seen Apple and other big tech companies like Microsoft really leverage privacy in their branding in the past few years, and very recently we see more and more even startups, right, do the same, and other companies that you would never think, some data brokers even come out and talk about how their product, their business model of selling, of monetizing personal data is being retooled to be privacy preserving. What are some of the So before I jump to the next question, I want to highlight one of the comments you made about privacy as value as a competitive advantage. So yeah, we saw that with Apple and Microsoft, but we're also seeing it here with the rise of privacy tech, right? Like a lot of companies are looking at the opportunities to build in this space. What are some of the interesting opportunities that you're seeing? So we talked about some in the consumer privacy tech space, about DSARs and authorized agents. I'm curious if there are other let's start with consumer privacy tech, if there are some of those interesting opportunities, aside from what we've covered, that you're tracking or that's interesting to you.
Yeah, the third part of the study we looked at was for existing product categories. So in contrast with new and emerging kind of privacy enhancing tools, for existing products, what are the benefits to companies who try to compete on the basis of privacy and security? So I think it can be as simple as marketing and highlighting your superior practices. Now, the risk of this is like you don't want to get into a position where privacy is like an organic label and everyone's tripping over themselves to show that they're organic, even if it's just the same food that everyone else is eating. But we think there's some evidence, right? When we looked at, even categories people don't necessarily associate with privacy, it looked like people, when you would market something, not just like a feature, right? Because you can imagine features that your competitors don't have, but also like third-party certification or third-party recognition. So a really highly weighted factor in the conjoint analysis tended to be things around, independently recognized as the market leader in privacy, right? Or achieve the highest level of certification for IoT security, those kinds of things. That, again, you can't take those to the bank, it's just a conjoint analysis, but it does indicate, it's one more, piece of the puzzle that indicates that, consumers do value this stuff. And I think the challenge for any company, any marketing department, any entrepreneur is to figure out how to capture that slice of the market. And I don't think I can really give any great wisdom, in the abstract, but I think that Michelle made a great comment here. Volvo has made safety a brand assumption that has lasted over 40 years. That's a huge ROI for these ancient ad campaigns. And the history of Consumer Reports in some ways is making safety a dimension of the competition between automakers. So before Consumer Reports did, advocated for seatbelts and crash safety testing, created a lot of comparative data. You'd buy a car based on different comparative measures. How fast is it? How good is the gas mileage? Does it have neat features? Does it look neat? But it's definitely the case that car buyers, they think about safety. And that may seem intuitive, but it wasn't in the 50s and 60s. We had to make it intuitive. We had to make it into part of the competition. So I think the idea with privacy is we got to do the same thing. We have to get consumers the information they need. We have to help train them how to make a comparison. And there's so many interesting ideas in this vein. Lori Craner, I know, is speaking now on the other panel, has this terrific idea of a privacy and security nutrition label. Yes. So, you pick up the cereal box, you can see how many calories. You pick up the IoT appliance box, and you can see, some of those similar things. The more of that we have, the more likely we can help companies do the right thing. I mean, it's nice to say in the abstract, there is a market for privacy, but it's true that we need some things that structure that market and enable supply to benefit from what demand wants. Today, and until recently, I'd argue, we didn't really have those conditions. That's why we said at the top, it was like a bit of a failed market. So GDPR, CCPA, things like a nutrition label, these are all components, long-term components of helping create that competition and helping create that race to the top. A market is very healthy when the ways that the companies are competing to better serve consumers. And it's been too long that some of the ways of competing have been to run over what consumers want, right? There's been a race to the bottom in terms of data collection and all those things. Again, all super macro stuff, but this is the point that we're trying to make with data.
Yeah, on the Volvo and auto safety point, we are seeing startups respond to this problem, right? We have Privacy for Cars, Andrea, who is working with dealerships and others in building a solution to address some of the over collection that cars and conduct when you perform, when you collect, when you connect your smartphone to a rental, for instance. Mm-hmm. And then on the privacy labels point, I was really excited. I was just chatting with Lori, one of my Santa Clara Law webcasts, and we were very excited to see that Apple implement this idea that she and her team had researched for, I think, more than a decade. And with the rollout of iOS 14, it's encouraging to see that Apple is demanding this of the apps in their platform. I'm interested how the market is going to respond to those who are not in compliance with this new privacy nutrition label requirement. I'm hoping to see that the demand that we're seeing is going to reflect in how consumers are working with or choosing the apps that they trust, especially with these new privacy labels coming out. We have some interesting comments. Tony mentions that he has asked Rivian on the car privacy point. It's asked Rivian, a new EV car startup, to explain the privacy policy and how they were going to collect and use data. The response was a generic, "We are going to do good, trust us." And this isn't just with the car industry, with auto startups. We also see this with new social media apps. I've personally, asked founders about, not in the privacy tech space, obviously, but in the social media space, about what they're doing with their new app that's collecting a lot of audio, and at least Tony got a response that they're going to do good. But in some of my experiences, I've had no response at all. We have a question about sending mass data access requests to companies isn't a good approach. We can cripple small businesses this way, and I do get that concern. I think the CCPA addresses that through an applicability provision, right? Like you have to have a minimum revenue requirement for the provisions to apply. But he asked, is there no more intelligent approach possible?
Well, that's a great question. It's one of my favorite things to think and talk about right now. But let me just quickly say to Tony, if you suspect something shady is happening, especially with a car company, please drop us a line at Consumer Reports. Really, I really mean it. As far as Tony's question earlier about the mass data access request, I think back to emissions laws, and California was the state that took the first step on auto emissions. The argument you heard back then is this is going to raise costs for the companies, going to raise costs for consumers. It's a lot of the same arguments in some ways, and it's true. It's true, especially in the short term. It's true, but I think that this is the cost of kind of raising the floor, and this is the cost of having like a public safety regime in place, And so the CCPA is intended to raise the costs of not thinking about data minimization, of not having really good processes to honor consumer requests and things like that. So what you said, Lourdes, is right. I think the threshold is 25 million a year in revenue. So, for the really small guys, it hopefully shouldn't be an issue. But, for everyone else, it should have the intended effect of driving investments in helping refactor legacy data practices. And yeah, there's probably some short-term pain. We have to acknowledge that. But it's going to be better in the long run for everybody. We're all consumers. We don't want laissez-faire approaches to our data. And I think that there's a rights component to this too. Privacy is a right. It's not a setting. It's not an aspect of somebody's privacy policy. Privacy is a right. And what's really great about CCPA, even though it's going to create some additional costs in the short term, is we've now got these rights enshrined in law. And you, as a citizen, have agency over what's done with your data. And I think that that's got to be worth the cost. Now, can we find ways to drive down the cost? We hear a lot from companies that maybe the cost of responding to a request is like $150 per request, and that might be true, but that's because you don't have the economies of scale yet, right? So the cost is a function of like the denominator, and the numerator. And a lot of the companies I think attend this event and are thinking about the future, they're going to create the solutions and they're going to innovate in ways that help drive the cost down for everybody. And so I don't think that we should accept, the idea that this stuff is going to be wildly expensive. It may have a short-term cost, but the cost has to go down. And this community is a big part of that.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. I agree with you your comment that the economies of scale isn't there yet. I'm curious with the folks that we're gathering, the founders, the investors, the experts who have been thinking about privacy problems for years, the advocates for privacy products. What are some of the things that we can do together to help drive up the economies of scale and really leverage the increasing demand that we're seeing from both the consumer side and the business side when it comes to privacy?
This might sound like a pat answer, but I think what we need to do is drive public awareness that these rights exist, they exist, and you can use them. In my experience, if you find someone who doesn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about this and you let them know that they have these rights and that they can use them, it's a real, light bulb moment. It's a real empowering moment. CCPA itself polls amazingly well, like, would you like to have these rights? It's like 90% of people are in favor. That's more than apple pie, that's more than that's about as good as it gets. And so that's what I meant earlier when I said that in some ways consumers are ahead of the market on this, right? They're ready for, services and tools that help them exercise their rights. They're ready to have this level of empowerment that they have not had before. I think that the more awareness you've got, the faster the state change is going to happen. And I think the cheaper it's going to be,
Exactly.
because if the industry moves in concert, there's going to be a really great moment where a lot of new companies are going to be born, a lot of investors are going to make a lot of money, and we're all going to be better off because we're all going to have more control and agency, over the data that we generate day in, day out. So that's what I would say. Let's bang the drum. Let's wave the flag.
Exactly. And that's part of I see that you at Consumer Reports are tackling awareness and help move the needle there. That's also one of the things that we are interested in helping out with the rise of privacy tech with events like this. In terms of, and shout out to the consumer privacy tech founders that we have joining us, right? So take inspiration from what Ben just said. The consumer demand is there. It's just a matter of building and meeting that demand and catching up to that demand. Given your findings and everything that we've talked about today, what are some of the advice that you have for the founders out there, the investors out there that are listening in and who are interested in breaking into or just in the very early stage of breaking into the privacy tech space, who might be in the midst of conducting their own market research as they build or as they invest in privacy?
I'm always hesitant to give kind of blanket high level advice, but one thing that I always find is the more simple we can keep things, the better. So,
Right.
we all as privacy practitioners, we really understand this stuff on a deep level. We understand the systems, we understand the implications, we understand the technologies, and we need to make sure that we communicate clearly, to all of our stakeholders about what we're trying to build and what the benefits are to them. So it's for that reason that when we talk about the data rights stuff, I just like to focus on the rights. Yeah. Like you've got rights. That is such an empowering idea. But I think that advice is going to look different in everyone's different context.
Absolutely. But on your point on communication, I want to raise, the points that Michelle and Melanie say we need to create that story. And it sounds like the story that Consumer Reports or you, Ben, has adopted is focused on the right story. Mel raises a good point about, the story needing an emotional component, and it's something that we need to be better at, right? Like we've seen the climate tech space really leverage that in their messaging, and I'm hoping that with people like Melanie, who are experts in privacy communications, and the folks who are joining us today, that we can come up with compelling stories to fuel privacy innovation. I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I want to, and it looks like we addressed the audience's questions. If you have any, we're happy to answer them with whatever time we have left. But Ben, I want to thank you for joining us today, and obviously also thank the audience and the participants who are listening in. If you have any last words that you'd like to share, any call to action for those who are listening in, please feel free to do so. We would love to hear more about how we can collaborate with Consumer Reports in moving the needle forward when it comes to privacy innovation.
Totally. If you want to read the report that we've been talking about, and if you want to find ways to get involved in our work to create a race for the top, then check out thedigitalstandard.org. I'll say it again, it's thedigitalstandard.org.
I had the report linked because I had it open. But yeah, check out the digital standard as well.
And and just I'd say the digital standard, for context, we're trying to create a really clear framework for how to evaluate comparatively the relative privacy stuff. So check out the digital standard for that reason too. We'd love to find ways to collaborate with everyone that's part of this event, and hope to have a chance to talk with you again too, Lourdes.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for participating today with our Data Privacy Day event. We are grateful for you sharing with us the findings that you, Consumer Reports and the Media Networks, found in your recent study about the marketplace demand for privacy. And to those who are tuning in, thank you once again. And feel free to network or join the next few sessions. We have quite a few interesting ones coming up, including on topics that we discussed on, the consumer demand for privacy. Michelle Dennedy has one on demonstrating privacy's value coming up as well. I'll see you guys later at the sessions or at networking. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.